Greetings, friends. My name is Pavlo Stelmach, and I'm glad to present for you the new episode of our daily wrap-up series. And I want to start with the words international tribunal. These two words are increasingly heard in the media and diplomatic talks during the discussion of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The International Tribunal is a court that we hope will be able to bring justice to all persons guilty of aggression against our state, our people, and guilty of war crimes against our fellow citizens. And now it is important to unite the efforts of all countries so that the investigation of crimes and the punishment of the guilty persons take place as soon as possible.
What is why it's indispensable element of the peace formula is the establishment of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression committed by Russia against Ukraine. The crime of aggression is the alpha and omega of the war. To start a criminal and unprovoked war is to open the door to thousands of crimes committed during the hostilities and the occupied territory. Yes, it is necessary to bring to justice everyone who has committed war crimes. But only this is not enough. Thus, what minds is the hell of aggression has been measured, must also be punished. Who gave the order to start this criminal war and who organized the terror? This is what justice is.
According to Deputy Head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Smirnov, 45,000 houses and tens of thousands more civil infrastructure objects have been destroyed as of today. In particular, 1,500 schools and kindergartens were destroyed by Russians. 11,000 Ukrainian children were forcibly taken from Ukraine to Russia, and now they are being adopted so that Ukrainians cannot return them to their land. These figures are only those that have been confirmed. The real scale of the tragedy can be much larger. Moreover, Ukrainian prosecutors are always faced with phenomenal brutality in cities that were previously occupied by the Russians, but are now liberated by the armed forces of Ukraine. Interpretation, torture and rape. The Russians did everything cruel that could be invented. And this is not to mention the atrocities recorded by our forensic experts. After all, in every big city we find huge burials with civilians. They are tortured with their hands tied, bones broken and organs shot. And among the Russian victims are the elderly, women and children too. Those who, even if they wanted to, would not be able to harm the Russian military. For the aggressor, neither international conventions nor even the customs of war matter. They are not good at fighting, they are good at sowing bloody terror. And that is why it is important to bring justice as soon as possible, because the number of Ukrainian victims is increasing every day. But so far, the International Criminal Court has not registered proceedings regarding the Russian crime of aggression. And here we face a problem. After all, the court cannot open proceedings on its own initiative, because Russia has not ratified the Rome Statute. And the UN cannot go to court too, because the Kremlin has the right of veto. And that is why it is now important to find a legal way to hold the Russian Federation accountable. After all, a criminal sentence will allow the payment of reparations to begin, especially since Russia has frozen assets in Europe and the USA. And the countries of the world can now not spend their money from their budgets, but simply send frozen Russian money to Ukraine.
Russia has destroyed more than that amount of resources in Ukraine. Give it to the Ukrainians. Now, we have this wonderful international financial system, which goes a credit back to Bretton Woods. When we talk about the international-based world order, it goes back to Bretton Woods and other places right after World War II. And the green eye shade types, who are very much in charge of these institutions, say, well, wait a minute, we can't do that. That's completely out of the procedures we've established. Now, they're right about that. But guess what? When Putin began this large war in Ukraine, this big invasion, he busted out wide open that system. He put an extraordinary event in place involving deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, the kidnapping of children, the raping of women. You know the list of war crimes we're talking about. It's time to move beyond the green eye shade regulations that have dominated the system.
Calling an international criminal as criminal should be the norm in the civilized world, not a sign of excessive boldness. After all, we Ukrainians have proven to everyone that we can and will fight for the lives of our children and for our country until the complete victory. Russia is once again redeploying its planes, and if last week the Russian bombers changed deployment from Belarus to Russia, so now the planes are simply dispersed at different airports. According to British intelligence, now aviation is placed much deeper inside Russia than previous places. Let me remind you that on Monday night there were explosions at air bases near Engels and Ryazan. The Ministry of Defense of Russia accused the Ukrainians of using a drone. However, our ministry did not confirm this information. After all, military facilities are located 600 kilometers from our borders. And if it was our unmanned aircraft, it cannot be that monitoring systems did not record it. And the airfield itself is poorly protected by Russian air defense.
They will have the reduction of the quantity of aviation equipment, which suffered as a result of these mysterious explosions. We are talking about the fact that if they will restore, then there is still a question, will they restore? In order to restore, they need to have something and figure out how to do it. Perhaps donation will be introduced. They will be removed from other planes to be inserted into this.
I would like to note that the airbase in Engels is the main operational base of Russian long-range aviation in western Russia. This airbase hosts more than 30 heavy strategic bombers. However, as reported by Freedom Radio, referring to satellite images, 9 bombers have already disappeared from the airfield. Probably they were diverted to other directions. However, incidents near Engels and Ryazan show that barbaric attacks on Ukraine do not go unpunished. And surprisingly, the Kremlin was unable to protect even its strategic aviation, which once again proves that Russia's counterintelligence and aircraft defense are far from the best. After all, it is quite possible that the cause of the fires at the airports could be the actions of some kind anti-war forces inside Russia itself, the so-called Russian partisans. However, of course, because of these incidents, it became a little easier for Ukrainians as well. From the damaged airfields, planes took off and then launched missiles at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and probably the damaged bombers were carrying all those missiles too.
Ukraine is not obliged to limit its defense efforts to its territory. Ukraine has a guaranteed right to self-defense in accordance with Article 51 of the UN chapter, German government spokesman Stefan Geberstreit in the interview with Der Spiegel.
Yes, indeed, Ukraine is currently working on the development of a drone that can fly up to 1,000 kilometers. But the unmanned combat aerial vehicle is currently only at the final stage of testing. Instead, Russia increasingly uses Iranian drones. However, due to international pressure, Tehran is less and less willing to provide its military support to Moscow. Because if in October missile strikes were accompanied by the launch of drones, now Russia uses only its own missiles. And their fragments indicate that they were produced in the summer-autumn of this year, which means that Russia's old reserves have already been exhausted. Yes, the Russian Federation continues to produce missiles, despite the sanctions, but the pace and volume of this production does not keep up with costs after the mass attacks. And now the military industry has to work on strengthening air defense. After all, as our intelligence reports, the incidents at Russian airfields put on the agenda the question of withdrawing part of the air defense systems from the front line to protect its own facilities in the rear. As it turned out, air defense systems in Russia are not only imperfect, but also deficient. The European Commission announced a new package of sanctions against Russia. This was announced by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. According to her, the earlier introduction restrictions are already having a painful effect on the Russian Federation. And in the new package, almost 200 individuals and legal entities are added to the sanctions list. The list includes military personnel, representatives of the Russian defense industry, members of the Держдума and Federation Council ministers, governors and politicians.
This list covers key figures in Russia's brutal and deliberate missile strikes against civilians and in the kidnapping of Ukrainian children to Russia, and in the theft of Ukrainian agricultural products. Russia continues to bring death and devastation to Ukraine. It is deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. It is seeking to paralyze the country at the beginning of the winter. But we stand by Ukraine, and we will make Russia pay for its cruelty.
The European Commission also proposes sanctions against 3 more Russian banks, including a complete ban of transactions of the Russian Regional Development Bank. In addition, the new sanctions package proposes additional export restrictions on dual-use items, including certain chemical components, nerve agents, electronics and software that could be used for military purposes. The European Commission has also prepared measures to complicate Russia's access to drones. Russia tries to use them as much as possible, probably due to the fact that they are much cheaper than missiles, and they cause considerable damage to the Ukrainian energy system too. The European Commission plans to ban the direct export to Russia of motors for drones, as well as exports to third countries, such as Iran, which can supply drones to Russia. In addition, the 9th package of sanctions provides for the blocking of 4 more Russian TV channels on the air and on all platforms. However, not only in Europe, but also the USA continues to put pressure on Russia. Only yesterday, more than 10 companies were added to the export control list for supporting Russia's military or defense industrial base. Let me remind you that earlier Washington made it difficult for Iran to buy drones, and we thank our overseas partners for everything they do for Ukraine.
We see across their economy devastating effects from the sanctions that only grow, and in particular, if you are looking at Russia's effort to modernize its economy, whether it's energy technology, whether it's its basic telecommunication infrastructure, whether it's its defense and airspace industry, every single day that goes by with these sanctions in place, the burden on Russia gets heavier and heavier. Its ability to prosecute these kinds of wars gets weaker and weaker. Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, in an interview with CNN.
Of course, now we expect the USA recognition Russia as a terrorist country, as the European Parliament and NATO Parliamentary Assembly have already done. And we also expect help in creating an international tribunal to hold Putin and his accomplices accountable for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. But we talk about this in our first topic. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for our future videos. Subscribe to UATV English and goodbye.